In her book Oneness versus the 1% Shattering Illusions, Seeding Freedom, physicist, environmental activist, and ecofeminist Vandana Shiva claims for her involvement in the Chipko ecofeminist movement, and even more well known as a fierce critic of Monsanto, as well as the founder of Navdanya, a movement for seed freedom and biodiversity on Earth, states the following: climate change is not just global warming, to which the mechanical response is global cooling by life-destroying geoengineering experiments. Climate change is a disruption of the Earth's processes through which she regulates the climate. The consequence of this disruption is climate chaos and extreme and unpredictable events. In short, geoengineering is the intentional, large-scale intervention in the Earth's oceans, soils, and atmosphere, most often discussed in the context of combating climate change. Examples include blasting sulfate particles into the stratosphere to reflect the sun's rays, dumping iron particles into the oceans to nurture carbon dioxide, absorbing plankton, firing silver iodide into clouds to produce rain, genetically engineering crops so their foliage can better reflect sunlight. In this sense, when we talk about the financial power needed for healing our planet, the time for preventing a global cataclysm has long passed. As pointed out, for instance, by Greenpeace, we can notice a complete absence of effort from corporations. However, we are witnessing large corporate investments in space exploration and efforts to reach Mars, as if the long-term priority were to leave Earth for Mars. As stated on the NASA webpage, the exploration of Mars has been intertwined with NASA's search for life from the beginning. Within this context, I will focus on the global disappearance of bees. This phenomenon is referred to by scientists as colony collapse disorder, and some studies suggest that it is linked to glyphosate, the active substance found in the Roundup herbicide, which is widely used in the production of GMO crops today. Using the example of warnings about the dangers of GMO food systematically reported on a global scale by Arpad Pustai and in the Croatian context by Marian Jošt, I highlight two recent cases of the so-called mysterious extinction of bees in regional context in Serbia and Croatia. One case dates from 2019 when around 1,600 bee colonies died in a major poisoning incident in Kikinda. Another occurred in Međimurje in 2020 when around 57 million bees died. It is notable that none of the major media outlets raised the possibility of glyphosate's influence on these mass bee deaths. Artyom Lukin, assistant professor of international relations at the Far East University in Vladivostok, states that in 2020 we entered one of the most cataclysmic and fateful periods in the history of humankind. According to his estimates, this process began with the global financial crisis of 2008, and in 2020 the coronavirus pandemic devastated the global economy and exacerbated existing tensions between the ruling hegemon, the United States of America, and the emergent superpower China. Summarizing his view, in 2020, a war between the United States and China is not only possible but inevitable. It is also evident that this global trajectory signals an ending at least of natural food as it existed 100 years ago, and of organic food reflected in the growing global liberal interest in GMO food, as well as in systems of monoculture farming that do not support biodiversity. On the basis of apocalyptic climate changes in 2021, 1 year after the beginning of the pandemic, the state of the world led to increasing concern about the disappearance of bees. This issue was fictionally hinted at by the history of bees, in which Mayalunda introduces a segment set in China at the end of the 21st century. She describes an era in which bees have already died out and focuses on the novelistic fate of the tau family, fruit tree pollinators in District 242, Shirang, Sichuan, in 2098. The Chinese province of Hainan is known as the world capital of pears. However, the use of pesticide has led to a drastic reduction in the bee population in the area. As documented in the film Silence of the Bees, workers now artificially pollinate fruit trees, carefully transferring pollen from male to female flowers. At the same time, ecologists warn that various non-human animals carry microplastic particles both in and on their bodies. Research conducted in Copenhagen as well as in semi-urban and rural areas near the city has shown that 13 different synthetic polymers can be found on the bodies of bees. The most common is polyester, followed by polyethylene, and polyvinyl chloride. In this context, the anthropologist Al Hornberg raises the question of the relationship between anthropology and the Anthropocene, noting that most anthropologists are still preoccupied with understanding local experiences rather than global processes, such as climate change. The documentary Silence of the Bees, screenplay by Doug Schultz from 2011, warns of the mysterious death of bees. In the winter of 2006, beekeepers noticed an unusual phenomenon involving the mass dying of bees. In order to raise awareness of the importance of bees for maintaining the balance of nature and the survival of humanity, it is estimated that 1/3 of the world's food production depends directly on bee pollination. In 2017, the United Nations, on the initiative of the Slovenia, declared May 20th as World Bee Day. It has been established that glyphosate can influence the learning behavior of bees and over time affect the characteristics of the swarm in the hive. In practice, the concentrations of the herbicide Roundup used in alter reduce the short-term memory of bees. As the bees do not die immediately but return to the hive, they bring the herbicide into contact with the larva. This means that young bees will have a small flight range around the hive, and over time this will lead to the disappearance of the swarm. Plant breeder Marian Jošt pointed out in an article from 2014 that the decline and extinction of bees had already been discussed for a decade. At first, mobile phones and radiation were blamed, and later the chemicals used in food production. The National Service for Agricultural Statistics of the USA reports a reduction in the number of bees by half. Science refers to this phenomenon as colony collapse disorder, and studies suggest that the culprit is glyphosate, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, which is widely used today in the production of genetically modified crops. The journal Anthropology Today warned that worldwide citizen movements against glyphosate, the world's most widely used herbicide, have prompted renewed assessments of its safety. In Europe, it is expected that a long-term process will conclude that glyphosate is harmful to human health and should be banned in all 28 member states, which would represent a major blow to the agrochemical industry. From Vietnam and Thailand to Colombia and Mexico, the US government has threatened trade consequences in the event of such a ban. The message is clear: chemical regulation is an international, not merely a domestic, matter as the authors of the aforementioned issue of Anthropology Today point out. In this sense, the relationship between anthropology and the Anthropocene, as diagnosed by Al Hornberg, must move in the direction of contextualizing the global crisis. On the other hand, glyphosate has become a symbol of new populism. Thus, in Great Britain, Brexit supporters argued that an independent Britain would have the freedom to ban glyphosate. However, this proved to be just another promise that was quickly forgotten. The first case, as mentioned earlier, occurred in Kikinda in 2019 when around 1,600 bee colonies died. It was pointed out, among other things, that this kind of poisoning had not recorded before. Because the suffering of the bees was practically total, and the bees that apparently survived the poisoning in the first phase, as they were in a close brood, died completely in the following days immediately after hatching, which best illustrates the strength of the pesticide used. It is noticeable that the media use linguistic speciesism when referring to the death of bees, employing terms such as dead, perish, and hatching. However, in Old Slavic folklore, bees were described differently. It was said that they pass away rather than die, or oditi in Croatian. The second case occurred in January 2020 when 57 million bees died. It is noticeable that until September 2020, no major media outlets raised the possibility of glyphosate influencing mass bee deaths. Beekeeper Anton Todd pointed out that the bees were completely disorientated and simply fell. One would think that they had gone mad, but the cause is an insecticide with which some fields are treated. Journalist Maro Maršić, citing data from Monsanto, points out that Monsanto's corn is planted in western and eastern Croatia. As for Dalmatian Herzegovina, hybrid corn is not planted there, but glyphosate is used in viticulture and fruit growing. The same glyphosate preparation that Monsanto sells in Dalmatia is controversial worldwide. It is the active ingredient of the herbicide Roundup, a Monsanto product, which the World Health Organization declared a year earlier to probably cause cancer. What each of us can do, for instance, do not mow the grass too often. You can help create bee pastures, install bee bricks to increase biodiversity. The city of Brighton introduced a legal requirement that any new residential building over 5 meters in height must include special bricks that provide nesting spaces for solitary bees. These bricks have a series of narrow openings similar to natural nesting sites. Bee bricks were proposed to the authorities as early as 2019, and the provision was included in building permits issued by the Council from April 1st, 2020. You can construct a hotel for bees and other insects, as was done in Karlovec in 2021. It is also important to be aware, as Vandana Shiva points out, that monocultures lead to a decline in biodiversity and ecological imbalance. The geological epoch in which we live is called the Anthropocene by Paul Crutzen, the Capitolocene by Jason Moore, the Plantagencene by Anna Tsing, the Pterocene by Donna Haraway, or the Westocene by Marco Armiero. The term Westocene emphasizes the production and disposal of waste as key factors in planetary pollution. According to research from 2021, the onslaught of COVID-19 generated millions of tons of plastic waste in the form of gloves, face masks, and other items, with nearly 26,000 tons ending up in the oceans. The mythology and symbolism of bees as an absolute representation of life leads to Einstein's famous statement: if bees disappear from the planet Earth, man as a species will have about 4 years left to live. This warning was often echoed in the regional context by the multimedia artist Ivan Ladislav Galita as a serious caution. The moment the bees disappear, civilization disappears, and the moment man disappears, heaven and earth will be created in the same instant.